Hey there, welcome back. My name is Todd. This is vlog number 6. We're getting ready to play an ARIA session of 2-5. $1,000 cap today. Let's hit the felt. Let's go. Kicking things off, it folds around to me on the button, and I open to 15 with 6-4 suited. The small blind puts in the 3-bet to 45, and it's back on us. I think if he'd used a more standard sizing for his raise, this would be an easy fold, but we're in position and getting a really good price, so I go ahead and decide to see the flop. The flop is Queen 7-5, two-tone, and surprisingly, the small blind decides to check this flop. I would normally expect to see the pre-flop 3-better range bet for a small sizing on this texture, so when he checks, I think it's a good idea to start bluffing with our straight draw, and depending on the runout, we can choose to continue barreling or give up. I go ahead and bet 45, and without too much thinking, he makes the call. The turn is the 6 of clubs, so we do make a pair, but I'm still not convinced we have the best hand, so I decide to continue bluffing. This time I bet 150, and our opponent finds a pretty quick fold, so happy to take this one down and start building some momentum early on. In the next hand, we see an open to 15 from the button, and I'm in the big blind with ace-5 of clubs. This should probably just be a pure 3-bet against the button's wide opening range, but I decide to just call this time. The flop is king 6 deuce with 2 clubs, so we flop a flush draw and check it over to the button. He puts in a bet of 25, and we're obviously not going anywhere, but unfortunately when you bet such a large sizing relative to the pot, I don't think a check raise makes a ton of sense either. If he had bet around half pot or less, then a check raise would be reasonable, so since we're not folding or raising, that leaves us with one option, and that's a call. The turn is the king of clubs, and I check with the intention of check raising if we're given the opportunity, but unfortunately he checks it back this time. The river is the 9 of spades, and I think it's pretty unlikely we'll be running into a full house here, so I go ahead and I bet 45 for value, and after about 15 seconds of thinking it over, he finally lands on a call, and we take this one down. In this next one, the straddle is on, and we see a couple limps before the action is on us. We are on the button and look down at ace-deuce of hearts. I'm looking to isolate with my suited aces, so I raise it up to 50, and we see a call from the straddler and both limpers, so clearly the isolation strategy worked out beautifully. 4 ways to a flop, which we like quite a bit. It's ace-8 deuce with 2 diamonds, so we flop top and bottom pair, and when it checks to me, I decide to continue for $65. This is probably a small sizing mistake on my part. If it's heads up, this sizing makes a lot of sense, but when we have multiple opponents, it's probably best to size up, considering we're against 3 ranges, and we can get value from every other ace-X and all diamond draws. Anyways, the straddler has been very active, playing a wide range of hands, so he's not going anywhere, and the limper in middle position decides to call as well. The turn is the 7 of clubs, and at this point I think it's best to start shaping the pot to go for it all on the river. So I continue betting for 250 this time, and now we wait. The straddler goes deep into the tank and takes over a minute to fold, and then our opponent in middle position goes into the tank himself. We end up getting stared down for nearly 3 full minutes between the 2 opponents before they both decide to fold, and we take down another good pot. We're in the small blind for this next one. It's a straddled pot and folds all the way to us, and I decide to raise Queen 9 of hearts to 50. The straddler is the most active player at the table, and he goes ahead and defends. The flop is ace Queen 8 with a couple clubs, so we flop a pair. I think we have plenty of showdown value, but it's going to be hard to get value from worse hands, so for that reason I think a check is in order, and he checks it behind relatively quickly. The turn is the 7 of hearts, which seems safe enough to bet, so I decide to do just that for some protection and equity denial, and without much thought, our opponent decides to put in a raise to 120. This guy has shown up with a variety of hands that don't make a ton of sense, and I honestly haven't seen him bluff much at all, so I can probably comfortably fold this weak queen right now, but I decide to call and see what happens on the river. We see the 3 of hearts on the river, and I'm just hoping to get to showdown for free at this point, so when our opponent bets 100, Even though we're getting a ridiculous price, I just don't think we're ever good enough to call, and I decide to let it go. He was nice enough to share that he turned 2 pairs, so we do get a little relief in knowing that it was the correct fold on the river this time. We are 900 effective in this next one, and it's a straddled pot. I open the hijack to 30 with 10-9 of spades, and a tight middle-aged guy in the small blind puts in a 3-bet to 90. This is a pretty small sizing for a 3-bet, out of position in my opinion, and if the small blind had bet something closer to 120, which is what I'd expect to see, this would probably be a fold against this exact player type, but for this price I think it's fine to see a flop, so I put in the call. The flop is Jack 9-5 rainbow with a spade, so we flop a pair and a couple backdoors. Our opponent doesn't slow down though. He bets pretty big, to the tune of 150 actually. This is a pretty large sizing, so it definitely feels like an overpair to me, but we do have a pair ourselves, and like I said, we could turn some additional equity, so I go ahead and make the call. The turn is the king of spades, so we pick up a ton of outs in the form of a gut shot straight draw and a flush draw, as well as a straight flush draw. Our opponent slows down on this card and lands on a check. I don't think we'd ever see a check on this turn from pocket aces or a set of jacks or kings, and I'm not certain we'd see the large flop sizing from ace-king followed by a check, so I basically narrow my opponent down to something like ace-jack or pocket queens. The problem we're running into is our effective stack depth doesn't leave a ton of room for maneuverability. And this is one of the best turns we can ask for in regards to beginning a bluff, so I decide to bet 200 with the intention of jamming on the river, and he puts in the call. The river doesn't help us at all. It's the 4 of diamonds, so we're stuck with a pretty bad single pair. He checks it over again, and unfortunately we're stuck with only being able to jam for about half pot, which doesn't seem great, but we're also nearly a guaranteed loser, so I decide to go for it and jam, hoping to get a fold from the aforementioned hands, and without a thought, he flips in a call and we're shown pocket queens. I am not happy with how I played this one, but I'm not sure what else could have been done to win this hand either. Guys at these stakes don't like folding when they've already invested half their stacks, so running a river bluff for this sizing almost never works. I don't really think a turn jam makes any sense either, because none of my value hands would want to play it that way. I could maybe find a check on the turn to bluff for a larger size on the river relative to the pot size, or I could bet very small on the turn to set up a more advantageous river sizing for a bluff. Tough to say if anything I could have tried would have gotten him off of queens here, but as you might have seen in a previous vlog of mine, sometimes we range a player perfectly and still don't get to scare them off their hand, so nothing to do but top back up and win our money back. Next up, we're in the small blind with queen jack suited and see an open to 15 from early position followed by 4 callers. This hand doesn't make a ton of sense to just call and play out of position against this many people, so I decide to 3-bet, and I size up pretty big to 130 due to how many callers are involved. The original raiser puts in the call, and the player in the cutoff calls again as well. We see a jack-high rainbow flop, so we flop top pair with no backdoors, and to be honest, I think checking this flop makes a lot of sense when we're out of position multi-way. However, we do have top pair, and we're the 3-better, and our pair could use a little protection. So I decide to keep betting for 150, and to my surprise, both opponents make the call. At this point, I'm ready to slow it down and try to get to showdown because I can't imagine we're doing very well against both players when they call my bets. So when the 5 of diamonds hits the turn, I decide to check and evaluate what our opponents do. The original raiser in early position instantly jams all in for a little over 600. I realized when this player made the call on the flop that I really hadn't seen him raise anything pre-flop. He was basically limping every time when entering a pot, which usually means a pre-flop raise from this player type is weighted to the high pocket pairs. Since he didn't put in another raise pre-flop, I think we just ran into pocket queens again, so regardless of what we see from the player in the cutoff, I think we're landing on a fold here. The cutoff makes our decision a lot easier when he tank calls, and now I'm fully convinced we're in bad shape, so I stick to the plan, I let it go. We end up being correct on our range once again when the early position player flips over queens, and we end up seeing 6-3 of diamonds for the turn straight from the cutoff. He essentially had the nuts, so I'm not quite sure what the tank was all about, but at least now we know we're most certainly at the correct table to recoup our losses so far. If 6-3 is finding its way to the flop in a 3-bet pot. We see a limp from early position, middle position, and the button before looking down at ace-10 suited in the small blind. This is certainly a hand worth putting in an ISO raise, so I raise the price of poker to 35, sizing up because we're out of position, and every limper makes the call. Did I mention we're at the right table? 4 ways to a flop, which is ace-4-3 rainbow. We do flop top pair, but I think we need to find some strong checks when out of position for balance, especially when we're this multi-way. So I check. It checks around to the button, and he makes a sizable bet of 110. I don't think raising with a somewhat weak top pair, especially facing this large of a bet, makes a ton of sense, but folding top pair is out of the question, so I make the call, and everyone else folds. The turn is the king of spades, bringing in a backdoor spade draw, and when I check, the button decides to check it back almost instantly. The river is the 3 of hearts, so our kicker is no longer in play. I think going for some value with a bet on this river makes a lot of sense, considering most players will not check top pair on the flop, so we might actually get looked up by worse. But I decide to check, hoping the button takes a stab, and unfortunately he checks it back, which usually means we have the winner, and we do. We look down at another premium in the following orbit. There's an open to 20 from early position, and I'm in middle position with ace-queen offsuit. Both raising and calling make a lot of sense, but I don't think we should be implementing a pure strategy with this hand, even though it is near the top of range, so I decide to just call this time, and we end up seeing a call from the low jack, cutoff, button, and the big blind. So like I was saying, it's probably best to implement a pure strategy and just always put in a raise with a hand like this pre-flop instead of making this kind of mistake. I'm kidding. Sort of. The flop is queen 7-3 rainbow, so we flop top on a mostly static texture. When out of position this multi-way, it's usually a good idea to check, so that's what I do. The low jack puts in a bet of 35, the button makes the call, and the big blind puts in a check raise to 225. There are no real draws to speak of, so when we're 6 ways and we see this amount of aggression from the big blind, we're probably just up against a set or some weird 2-pair combination. So when early position folds, I embrace my internet and just let this one go. I can't think of any reasonable bluffs, and bluffing into 5 people with this line isn't very common, so I'm going to have to give him credit for this one. Nice hand. We're in the low jack for this one, and open it up to 15 with king-queen offsuit, and the cutoff and the button decide to come along for the ride. 3 ways to a queen-high flop with a couple diamonds, and this is a pretty dynamic texture given it's queen-high. There are a couple potential straight draws available, and the obvious diamond draw as well. Dynamic textures like this generally get a larger sizing when c-betting, so I bet 30 into 50, and only the button makes the call. The turn changes the texture quite a bit, completing one of the straight draws and the flush draw. When the texture changes like this, it's usually a good idea to slow down, so that's what I do and check. The button decides on a sizing of half pot, and I still think we could be good here often enough, so I call to evaluate what he does on the river. The river is a brick, something like the 3 of spades, and changes absolutely nothing for us. I'm still pleased with our strong top pair, but with the texture change on the turn, I'm just trying to get showdown on the cheap side, so I check, and luckily the button checks behind relatively quickly, which is usually a good sign for our hand, and we're good. Next up, we see an open to 15 from the hijack, and we look down at pocket 5s in the cutoff. I go ahead and make the call, and the button calls behind. 3 of us to a flop of 7-5 deuce rainbow. We drill middle set, and it checks to us. I'm not one to generally slow play big hands, especially when unblocking top pair like this, so I bet 20, the button folds, and the hijack calls. The turn is a little overkill. We see the last 5 in the deck. Some players fall into the trap of not continuing to go for value with the board so locked up, but we could still be up against a backdoor diamond draw or a straight draw, so I bet 40, but unfortunately he lets it go. Not the most interesting hand in the world, but I couldn't leave out our very first quads hand together. In the following orbit, I'm in middle position and look down at the greatest hand of all time, the Rockets. The straddle is on, so I open the action to 30, and we get a call from the cutoff, and the straddle defends his option as well. The flop is ace 7-3 with 2 hearts, so we hit another set, but on these ace-high textures with 3 of the aces accounted for, I think it's probably best to check and play this one a little deceptively. So the straddle checks, I check, and the player behind checks as well. The turn is the 10 of hearts, so unfortunately the flush draw completes right away. but I don't think the cutoff would check a flush draw on the flop, so when the straddle checks, I think it's time to start going for some value, and I go for about half pot for $50. To my surprise, the cutoff decides 50 isn't enough and puts in the min raise, making it 100 to go. Getting min raised is kind of annoying, but our hand is way too good to fold, and even if we did somehow run into a flush, we still have about a 25% likelihood to improve to a full house or better, so I make the call. The river falls into that 25% when we see the 10 of diamonds and we improve to a full house. I'm not quite sure where the cutoff stands on his hand strength, but I tend to not trust my opponents to value bet thin enough for my liking, especially at these stakes, so I take a bit of an unorthodox approach and lead jam for his remaining 250. This line is pretty fishy and doesn't make a ton of sense, but if he has a flush and gets scared when the board pairs and decides to check it back, that would be an absolute disaster. Anyways, he only thinks for about 10 seconds or so before calling. We show down our hand and he flashes us an ace before throwing his hand into the muck, so I'm happy we went for the max and ended up getting paid off. Over the next hour, I'm dealt a ton of playable hands, but none of them are very interesting. For example, there are a few limps before an ISO raise from the cutoff, and I decide to 3-bet ace-jack offsuit on the button to drive out the limpers. The flop is ace-high, and a small c-bet takes it down. I lose one with queen-10 suited when I miss the flop, but still c-bet with a couple backdoors. We get called and then raised, so had to let that one go. We ISO raise pocket eights from the cutoff when a couple limpers enter the pot and get called by one of them. We flop middle set on a dynamic texture, and a standard c-bet wins that one. I flop an overpair and a straight draw with pocket sevens and take that one down on the flop. And I actually miss a set with pocket deuces and fold to a big bet on the flop, so obviously it's not all run good this session. After all of that excitement, we find the best hand in poker again and open the action to 15 in the cutoff. The small blind calls, so we're heads up to a flop of ace-ace-deuce. Yeah. Anyways, we have too good of a hand on this static texture, so I think a check is warranted. The turn is the 9 of diamonds, and I can't check this hand again, so when he checks, I bet 15, and we win. A few more straightforward hands, and about an hour and a half go by before we find ourselves in this one. There have been a few personnel changes at the table, with some players busting and leaving, and another table breaking and joining ours. And the action dynamics with these new players has changed the game flow quite a bit, to say the least. The straddle is on, and the first player to act throws in a 10x raise to 100 in middle position. We're next to act in the low jack and look down at our favorite hand again, pocket aces. The middle position player only has about 400, so he's already committed a quarter of his stack. This open size shouldn't really be a thing, but we need to put in another raise, so I bump it up to 250 using a slightly smaller than normal size given his massive sizing and his stack depth, and the straddler decides he likes that price and puts in the cold call for 250. The action is back on middle position, and he elects to put all of his chips in the middle and goes all in for right around 400. Without asking for an exact count, I decide to put in the rejam, trying to force the straddler to either commit all of it or lose his dead 250, but when I do so, the dealer counts down middle position stack, and he only has $394. And that means he's $6 shy of a legal raise, and we're no longer allowed to raise. All we can do is call. Kind of a disaster scenario, but I'm obviously not folding, so I call, which brings along the straddler, and we're off to a flop three ways in this ridiculous $1,200 pot. The flop is king 4 deuce with a club draw, and the straddler checks it to us. I'll be honest, I'm kind of in uncharted waters on this one. This is a pretty bizarre situation. We still have about a pot-sized bet behind, and I'm fairly confident we're still ahead of the straddler, but I'm not sure what to do, so I end up spazzing a bit and just decide to go all in, basically hoping to get a crying call from ace-king or something along those lines. Not my greatest play ever, if I'm totally honest, but I never expect to see him show up with a set of kings, given the pre-flop action. He ends up folding, and we see a 6 of hearts on the turn and an offsuit 8 on the river. Middle position flips over his cards and shows us king queen of hearts, so he actually turned a ton of outs on us, so we managed to fade all of those and take it down. The straddler actually tells me later he had pocket 10s, and had the action been reopened for me to go all in, then he absolutely was calling it off, so kind of unfortunate for us that middle position player decided to play this one so big out of the gate, because if he didn't, we're probably going to get a full double up on this one. Oh well. Hard to complain when we still take down a really big pot, so happy to recoup everything that we've lost so far. It's Monday afternoon now. I didn't finish up that session until about 4 in the morning last night. I was pretty wiped out. So we are in downtown Summerlin enjoying some happy hour on a day off. I had one more hand to go through before the session was finished. It was in my last orbit. So there's a straddle on in this hand. I'm in the cutoff and open it to 30 with ace-king offsuit. The straddler goes ahead and defends. The flop is Jack 5-3 rainbow. And I think we have enough showdown value with this hand specifically to go ahead and just check it. So when he checks, I check it back. Turn is the ace of hearts, so that's a pretty good card for us, obviously. And it does bring in a backdoor flush draw. He goes ahead and leads this one for $50. And I think we have probably a candidate that could go ahead and raise, but I think it's probably just fine to go ahead and call and keep his bluffs in there. So I just call. The river is the queen of spades, which isn't the best run out in the world. I was planning to raise a lot of rivers, but this just isn't one of them. So when he bets 80, I go ahead and just call. He announces that he missed. We show our hand, he mucks, and we're good. So like I said, we ended up playing for 7.5 hours. That we were in until about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. In for 2,100. Shot myself in the foot a little bit with that queen's hand. We paid for that the rest of the session. Wasn't happy with that. It took me a little bit to kind of recover mentally because I was beating myself up. But stuck in there, found some good hands, finally was able to get some value out of some people, and we cashed out for $2,700 on the dot. So like I said, 7.5 hours, $600 win. I'll take it. If you enjoyed this and you feel inclined, please go ahead and leave a like. Comment down below. Let me know why you watch these things and how long you've been playing live poker, if you don't mind. I would love to get to know you just a little bit better. And if you want to see more of these, go ahead and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on vlog number 7. Thanks.